everything comes to the floor in such a hyper-partisan manner.
I would argue that it's already in the Constitution. We've overtaxed people. People like to legislate by emotion.
It's important to address when the governor oversteps his boundaries.
I'll pull up my pocket version here. 1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson. I'm a state representative from District 23B in southern Minnesota, and with me today is Walter Hudson, co-hosting again. Walter, welcome.
Glad to be back, representing Albertville as a city council member in the Northwestern Metro, former professional political commentator, had a radio show for a few years, and just enjoy getting together once a week and talking shop.
Well, first of all, I want to apologize for last week's episode. If you struggled through that one, for some reason, my audio, the big honking mic that I held, the studio mic, didn't connect correctly, and it went onto some rinky-dink laptop mic, so the audio was horrible on my end, and the video, if you watched it on YouTube or Facebook, for some reason, the taxpayer Wi-Fi at the Capitol was less than stellar. So I apologize for that. Hopefully, we get this episode get this episode right. So I wanted to kick off this first episode after the special session and kind of do a wrap up on what happened in the final hours of the legislative session. The last week's episode, I talked about an amendment that we were going to be offering. And Walter, you were like in the know. There was only a handful of people that were aware of what was coming. Most of the Democrats didn't know, and just a handful of people in the Republican-controlled Senate knew. But this amendment, what it does is it makes it illegal for a legislator to take a job working for a firm whose sole purpose is lobbying or public policy, public advocacy. And there's been, throughout the last few decades, several legislators on both sides of the aisle that have taken jobs working for lobbying firms. And what's so disgusting about that behavior, if it's one thing if you're sitting on a nonprofit board for, education, I know that you're advocating for education. But when you are working for a lobbying firm, a contract lobbying firm who represents dozens or hundreds of clients, I don't know where your conflicts are, and neither do your constituents, especially a lobbying firm like, Representative Kurt Dowd, who's the minority leader of the Republicans in the House. He works for Stateside and Associates, and they represent big pharma. They represent GlaxoSmithKline. They represent major broadband companies, solar manufacturers, all these things that have a conflict with his district. And so we just said, this is enough. And we offered this amendment. It was a surprise to most, including Kurt Dowd. And we did a roll call vote on it. We got 15 hands to support a roll call and got everybody on the record. And the way it broke down was originally Kurt Dowd's people ran around telling the Republicans to just stay off the board. Don't vote at all, because it would be a really bad vote to vote no on it. And the best thing they could do is to try to kill the bill. So most of them didn't vote at all. And then a few people were on the phone, and Rod Hamilton spoke up on the phone and said, "Hamilton, aye." So he put himself on the board, and so did a few other people. A few people in the room stood up because the Speaker of the House locked the board so no one else could vote. And people that were off the board decided they wanted to vote, so they were standing up, putting their thumb in the air. People on the phone were speaking up. People out in the chamber were yelling to get on the board. And one by one, more and more Republicans jumped on, voting yes for that amendment. And it, I think overall, there was 118 of the 134 people voted yes. And the only person that voted no was a Democrat whose tax bill we were amending this onto, just didn't want it on his bill. So he voted no, but the Speaker did not vote. She didn't want to have a major conflict in there and look like she was being vengeful against Kurt. But the majority of Republicans voted yes. So it was a great night for transparency and honesty.
It's good to know that can happen once in a while.
Yeah, and there was it could have. I think Kurt Dowd didn't vote for it, and it could have got ugly on the floor if it became a personal fight and he didn't raise a stink and he didn't make it about him. So that was good. This applies to, more than Kurt Dowd. And so other legislators are going to have to reassess what they want to do for, a day job if they are working for groups who, whose sole purpose is public policy and advocacy. So going forward, I think this will be really great to clean up the legislature. And it was really hard to, I've carried this bill for 3 years. It was really hard to advocate for something that restricts us, right? This bill doesn't impact anybody outside the legislature. It's just the House and Senate. But, it's like term limits, trying to carry term limits. Everybody's opposed to restricting their own interests. And I'm so glad this amendment or this bill really got through this language, and and the governor signed it into law. In fact, I heard from a Senate colleague that Kurt Doubt was trying to call and kill the tax bill. In fact, at the end of that was the last amendment, I should say. The legislator lobbyist language was the last amendment on the tax bill, and then and I should explain to people that the tax bill is the last bill to pass the legislature, and so it ends up being this kind of miscellaneous bucket that a lot of the last end of session compromise language gets attached to. So rarely anything being attached to the tax bill is germane. But what happened is after that amendment was attached, then uh, Kurt Dowd and his team tried to kill the bill. They tried to convince all Republicans that they should vote against $1 billion in tax cuts and, PPP loan, forgiveness, tax conformity, all this stuff. He tried to convince all these Republicans to vote against it. And every single Republican House member voted no on the tax bill in order to kill it. In fact, when it came up when it came up on the board, there were 67 votes for it, and you need 68 votes to pass it. So it was killed by Kurt Dowd, and two members of our caucus voted for the bill to get it across the finish line. That was Cal Bahr and Tim Miller voted yes on the tax bill to get it across the finish line. So I can't believe that he was so spiteful on that bill to kill the entire bill.
Well, and what it goes to show, it's so remarkable, and I think people properly ought to pause and consider how remarkable it is, because we're consistently told how impossible it is to get anything done in St. Paul, and how, well, we're in the minority, and so there's only so much we can do, and we got to wait until we have all three legs of the three-legged stool and all this. And yet here what you're telling me is that when Kurt Doubt's personal financial interests were at stake, he was able to ably whip almost all, well, was it the entire old House Republican caucus?
Every single person voted no.
Every single member of the old House Republican caucus, he was able to whip against the supposed interests of their constituents, right? Because otherwise, if this amendment wasn't there, they would have easily passed it, and they would have gone back to their districts and talked about all the wonderful things that they've done on behalf of those who elected them. And what this tells you is that they were willing to throw all of those perceived benefits, like set aside the analysis of whether or not the tax omnibus bill was good or bad. There are perceived benefits there that these same legislators would come back to their people and say, well, we did this for you and we did that for you. We got you tax conformity. We got you a tax cut. They were willing to sacrifice all of that and voted to sacrifice all of that in order to protect the personal financial interests of Kurt Doubt, because he told them to. Well, that tells you how things work in St. Paul.
Yeah, I mean, of all the bills that passed with Republican support in the House, because there was 12 or 14 omnibus bills that passed. This one was presumably the best one because it had so many things that Republicans fought for. I voted against this bill because of how the process and how it's formed, and because it's a multi-subject omnibus bill. And I wanted to vote against every single budget bill because we didn't actually address Chapter 12 emergency powers, which I think is one of the most important thing for our state right now is to fix our constitutional crisis. But for so many Republicans who did vote for most of the other bills, this was an easy yes for them, and they all voted no. Now, there was one other amendment that happened earlier in the day that I wanted to talk about, and it was altering the COVID response. So it took away the governor's powers under Chapter 12, specifically for COVID-19. It didn't end Chapter 12 or alter it permanently so he can't declare another emergency. But we had previously ended the emergency, and then also put in this change to say everything that the government is going to be doing in response to COVID-19 must be handled under Chapter 144, which we talked about earlier, which is part of Cal Bahr's Never Again bill. And it basically says, so again, doesn't permanently alter Chapter 12. It was actually what's called session law, which is, it's not permanent statute. It's just for this year, but it is saying that the response must be under Chapter 144. The governor doesn't have any more powers for this. It is specifically the Commissioner of Health, or Jan Malcolm, that can direct the COVID response, the testing, vaccination strategies, and such, and directing resources. And of course, she has to go to a court of law. She's going to infringe on people's civil liberties to get permission. And the Senate would have authority to basically unconfirm her or fire her should she step out of line. And that was the amendment. It was good language. It was a negotiation between Gazelka and Hortman and the governor, and I supported it and spoke in favor of it on the floor. Kurt Dowd got his caucus all, wound up tight, thinking that this was expanding the governor's powers, which absolutely did not do that. It was, specifically written. We've been pitching Cal's Never Again bill to the Senate, and this language is really mimicking much of what Cal's bill does. Now, the problem is, if the Senate is to have oversight over Jan Malcolm, they need to stay in session. Okay. So, because if they're not in session, they can't have hearings and fire her. So, what I was talking to my colleagues in the Senate, their plan was to stay in session through September because we have a special session in September. So, they wanted to the House was going to adjourn after we pass the tax bill. That way, the Senate must accept it. And then the Senate was going to pass it, but then stay in session. And they were going to say that it was just to watch governors sign these bills into law. But in reality, this week, they were going to come back and start having hearings and firing commissioners and stay in session until September. So they came back. What do we got? Today's Wednesday. So they came back on Tuesday and started holding hearings, and they confirmed 2 commissioners. So ones that they didn't think were bad. And then they were going to fire the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency commissioner for her work in implementing the California car emission standards and stuff like that. And in anticipation of being fired, she resigned so she didn't have to go through hearings and disclose Walz's favoritism towards California car mandates. And their work was done in firing her. She resigned, but they should have stayed in session. They should have had hearings on Malcolm. They should have, I heard that the deed commissioner, the commissioner of the Department of Employment and Economic Development, would be probably next to be fired. But instead, Democrat Susan Kent made a motion to adjourn, and the Republicans didn't have the votes to say no. And only 18 Republican senators voted to not adjourn. So in other words, they adjourned sine die and now have no authority to fire Malcolm if she steps out of line in a response to COVID.
So, what's the intentionality behind that? Was this Republicans in the Senate just getting caught unawares, flanked by parliamentary procedure, or do you think it was an intent to not have that responsibility and not move forward with the plan?
So I think there's a few things in play. One, for many Republicans that are in swing districts, they need to get out and start campaigning now. They feel like this summer is important for them to go do parades and town halls and get going on their reelection. For 2 senators specifically that are considering running for governor, they want to get their gubernatorial campaign kicked off. They need to fundraise like crazy because Jensen is way out ahead of them, and they want it to be done. They can't really be campaigning while they're in session. There's some good conservatives. I shouldn't say good. There are some decent conservative senators who voted to adjourn, and I don't understand why. But they did. And I know from my sources there that they were talking in caucus about the constitutional checks and balances and why it's important to stay in place and oversee Malcolm. But there are squishy Republican senators who don't want to be forced to vote on Malcolm because they're going to vote not to fire her. and they don't want that held over their heads with their conservative base. They don't want to lose their endorsement because the base wants them to fire Commissioner Malcolm, and that's a concern. And so I think they just didn't want to have the vote. Last year, they fired a commissioner, and then they brought up another name in caucus that they were going to fire, and they didn't have the votes. Actually, I shouldn't. They brought it up on the floor. It was an actual vote, and I think Senjum flipped, and he voted to confirm instead of taking a walk or voting no to not confirm, and they ended up confirming that senator. So they just didn't have the votes. There's a narrow majority, and two independents that caucus with the Republicans, but are friends with all the Democrat commissioners.
Yeah, and again, contrast that development, that parliamentary drama, with the previous story you told about the Republicans in the House marching in lockstep to the minority leader, Kurt Doubt, when he wanted them to protect his personal financial well-being and his personal financial profit. It just goes to show you what's really important in St. Paul. It's not you, it's not your interests, it's not what the activists want, it's not the desire to hold the line on something like firing commissioners like Jan Malcolm. But if the right person's personal financial interests are at stake, boy, they're going to march to the same tune, and it's going to be in lockstep, and there's going to be no hesitation. And mysteriously, all the legislative fog of war is going to clear, and things are going to get done.
Yeah. And I don't want to accuse everybody voting against the tax bill in the other caucus of doing so to support Kurt Doubt. But looking at all the votes throughout the special session, there were always, 20, 30, or 40 Republicans that voted for these omnibus bills. So I'm sure before the bill came to the floor, because the Democrats didn't have the vote to pass the tax bill, because the Posse caucus voted against it. And so she needed votes to pass it. And so she would have presumably reached out to Kurt Doubt and said, "Hey, we're going to need a few votes to pass the tax bill." And I'm sure he's like, "Yeah, well, Greg Davids, or people that always vote for him, they're going to vote for him." So, and for people that PPP loan conformity, tax forgiveness, if that was their big issue for their district, they would have voted for it because that's what was in there. So, anyways, I just wanted to not vilify everybody that voted no, but I think that it was surprising that every single Republican in that caucus voted against the tax bill. So we do have a special session in September, probably September 6th or in the first couple weeks of September. We will be back. The House and Senate have to come back to pass a bill to distribute $250 million of taxpayer money to essential workers in the form of a bonus check. Okay. And maybe we talked about this in the show already, but basically they came up with a bunch of extra money because there's billions of dollars of your money sitting at the Capitol. And because it's an election year, and because Gazelka and Benson and Governor Walz are all going to be campaigning for governor, they want to buy some votes. They're going to take $250 million, and each of the, Gazelka, Walz, and Melissa Hortman got to each choose 3 people to be on a committee. So there's 9 people, and together they'll decide who's essential and who's not to receive these bonuses after the fact. So they're not paying people who lost their jobs last year. They're paying only certain groups of people. And it could be a $200 bonus. It could be a $1,000 bonus, but they are working that out. And then they'll come back in September and tell the rest of the majority caucuses in each house how they're going to vote. And this will presumably just be rubber stamped in and out in a day.
Yeah. Well, and it's morally reprehensible. That this is taxpayer money that came from people who earned it and was seized under the auspices of a common good, a public good, and it's going to be redistributed for explicitly political purposes. The deliberation that these 3, the governor and Gazelka and Hortman, are going to go through is not rooted in any sort of economic reality. They are not taking into consideration things like supply and demand and logistics and real things that could be characterized as common good in the sense that when price is free to reflect what actually goes in to the production of a product and service, that is a common good in the sense that it lets the rest of us know whether we should be consuming more, consuming less, producing more, producing less, what types of decisions we should be making about where we live and what we do for a living and what have you. And they're distorting all of that in order to buy votes, as you put it. That is morally reprehensible. And the fact that, again, we've got Republicans who are joining in on this rather than calling it out and fighting it tooth and nail tells us exactly where our problem is.
Yeah, so I don't look forward to that special session. I'm pretty well convinced that I'm going to be voting no on that bill that comes through, because I don't like the process. I don't like the principle. I know that there were people that worked extra hard during COVID, but there were also a lot of people who were told they're not essential and
Right.
they can't provide for their families. And so, just on principle, I'll be voting no on that. I will be introducing a few bills that we're working on during the special session, just so we can get them out there and kind of continue working on stuff. And it will be also interesting if the Senate threatens to fire Malcolm or fire a commissioner, if the governor will then refuse to call a special session because he doesn't want to give the Senate the opportunity to fire anybody. Because, like I said, the governor must call the legislature to a special session, but the leaders of each body determine when they adjourn. And so the Senate can just stay in session.
Right.
So
Yeah, it is a
Walter,
pickle.
yeah. So Walter, you had a post today about your son
Yeah.
receiving some, predatory text messages from kind of stranger danger stuff going on, something about drug dealers. Can you tell us about
Right.
that?
So a little bit of background. My son, I think sometime in the last year, got his own cell phone. And so, in an attempt at parental due diligence, I researched and installed a parental monitoring app. And what it does is it scans his apps and his text messages, his YouTube account, and it lets me know if anything comes across his phone that triggers certain tags, like something will come tagged violence, or it'll come tagged profanity or drug related or whatever. And I was getting a dozen of these a day, these notifications, and it was all benign stuff. And I went in within the last week or so and I figured out how to turn down the sensitivity so that I would only get stuff that matters. And so now when I get one of these notifications, it really perks up my interest, which is the way you want it, right? Like, you don't want to ignore something because it's in the mix of a bunch of irrelevant stuff. Well, today I got a whole bunch of notifications. And it's while I was on the road, while I was doing my job. And so I pulled over and I looked into it. And what I saw was that my 12-year-old son had received 3 texts from an unknown adult source. And the purpose of these texts were to solicit his participation in a drug pushing ring, an interstate drug pushing ring. Now, I posted these texts online, or the notifications that I got, and I'll read a couple of them here for you. The first one is, "Hi, this is the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services with COVID-19 vaccine info." And then the follow-up text from the same number, "Eligible residents who have received at least 1 dose of the vaccine can enter for a chance to win $2 million in other prizes." And then there was an earlier text from the same number asking whether or not he could be counted on to encourage others to take the vaccine. And so here you have adults who are contacting children without parental notification or permission in an attempt to solicit medical information and to recruit them with the promise of potential money in a gambling scheme. Submit your name to a sweepstakes, you potentially get $2 million. And what's the judgment of a child going to be in that situation? Let's say he responds and now he's in this back and forth with the Michigan, we live in Minnesota, the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services about his vaccination status and his friends and his family. And all of this going on, if I didn't have this app installed, all this could be going on completely without my knowledge. Now, I'm a little tongue in cheek when I describe it as an unknown adult soliciting my child to enter into an interstate drug trafficking and drug pushing ring, but not by much. Like, it's not much of an exaggeration at all, in point of fact, especially when you take into consideration that this is all being funded by tax dollars. So money that is being seized from people who have earned it is being spent in order to pay cronies to go out and influence the medical decisions of private citizens and now apparently their children. This should make people angry. I don't think it makes enough people angry. I don't think people really think about through the implications of this type of activity. And if this doesn't offend you, imagine what else they could do that might slip under your radar, if you even have a radar in place, under the auspices of public good and common good and public health and all of these rationales and justifications that we've accepted over the course of the past couple of years. It just really highlights the extent to which the characterizations that used to be in dystopian fiction about Big Brother and the surveillance state and the ability of the government to peek into your home and peek into your family life are coming true in rapid fashion right before our eyes.
Well, I reached out to House Research when Governor Walz started his campaign of that stranger danger campaign of giving kids like candy and a free day at Nickelodeon Universe if they got vaccinated. And because I was concerned that I've got a 13-year-old daughter. I don't want her going to sign up for a pair of Nikes, because she probably would be vaccinated if she could get a pair of Nike, whatever the latest shoe is. And so I wanted to make sure that that kids in Minnesota couldn't opt to be vaccinated without their parents' consent. We've had several pieces of legislation pass in recent years, which has empowered children to make their own healthcare decisions on a multitude of things, and it's not just abortion and birth control, but several. If you're a parent and you bring your child to the doctor, they make you leave the room, and it's
Yep.
very concerning if you have a 13-year-old, because you don't know what's going on, you know what they're
Right.
getting injected with. And so there's certain vaccines and certain healthcare decisions that your child can make for themselves, and you have no idea and you're not notified. But this vaccine, specifically an experimental one, can't be given to your child without your permission, supposedly. But that's but in other states, it's not that way.
Well, and it's regardless of whether or not that's the case, the practice and the methodology surrounding the practice, it has the effect of undermining parental authority. You are directly contacting my child as a public employee. That should never happen under any circumstances. You come to me to talk to me about my family, about my child, right? Like, you don't engage my child at all, certainly not without my knowledge or my consent. And then secondarily to that, you mentioned stranger danger. If this becomes acceptable, if we accept the premise that under the auspices of public health, it's okay for the state to sidestep mom and dad and go straight to the kids, then this becomes pretty quickly a predatory tactic for people who aren't employees of the government, right? Like, forget about the stereotypical guy in a white panel van offering candy to kids at the playground. Now you could potentially have somebody who gets a hold of your kid's telephone number or social media account or whatever, and starts messaging them under pretending to be a public health official, saying, hey, just want to make sure you're safe. Just want to make sure you're not going to get a virus that might kill you or your family, people you care about, and manipulating that fear, drawing the child into an interaction that has an ulterior and horrifically abusive motive. That's possible.
Come and get your vaccine for a free Xbox 360 or
Yeah,
whatever
right.
and we'll meet you here behind the school at this time. Yeah, that's pretty scary. I wanted to on the topic of COVID mention that the New York Post had an article today or a couple days ago that fears arise that the Lambda COVID-19 variant from Peru may be resistant to vaccines. So now we have more fear porn on these variants of the virus that are resistant to vaccines. So maybe more reason to question whether you want to get the vaccine. But I thought it was funny. Somebody on my post, because it's called Lambda, the Lambda COVID-19, they had like the Lambda from Revenge of the Nerds. The nerd.
Sure.
It's very funny in the Delta vaccines. One thing I wanted to talk to you about was the Star Tribune ran an article talking about because of the lack of police reforms during the special session of the legislature, a bunch of activists showed up there, super loud, screaming, yelling at legislators for not, punishing our police, and
Right.
they vowed to protest outside of lawmakers' homes.
Hmm.
I'm kind of torn on this one because I don't like the fact that protesters might surround my house when I'm at work and scare the snot out of my kids
Right.
by screaming profanities out in the street.
Right.
But on the other hand, the legislature was mostly remote this year, and they had a fence around the Capitol almost the entire session for a year. And so, if you as a voter have a constitutional right under the First Amendment to petition your government for a redress of grievances. That is your absolute right. And when we fence you out, and even with the fencing, you could come outside and scream with a megaphone, but the legislature wasn't there, right? People were dialing in from Zoom. They have no idea there's people screaming outside of their offices because they're not even in the same city. Many of them weren't even in the same state. They were dialing it in from Arizona and such. So when the legislature is remote, there's no way for you to petition your government for change. And so to go to their houses to protest outside their house seems like it may be the only way to get your message to your legislator. And so I'm kind of torn on this one, and I made a post about it and kind of asked for feedback because as long as you're respectful in protesting outside someone's house, as respectful as you can be, right? You're going to be loud and make noise and kind of annoy the neighbors a little bit, but not make threats, not burn effigies on their yard. I think it should be allowed.
I am much less conflicted than you are, primarily because I think we have different views of how to apply and interpret the First Amendment and the whole concept of freedom of speech. The right to petition your government for a redress of grievances. Absolutely. I agree with those words. What do those words imply? Does it mean that I can come? Does it mean that I can do what they did on January 6th? That I can push back barricades and storm into the Capitol and make a ruckus and take pictures and knock things over, whatever all it is that they did on January 6th, which we've been told, by the way, was an insurrection and has been investigated as a federal interstate terrorism, and we've had people who've gone to jail over it and are probably going to stay there for decades. And so we've got that happening as a backdrop to this. Let's just lay that out there, right? The contrast between how people on January 6th have been treated and are continuing to be treated versus the treatment of people who want to do this protest out in front of people's homes. I just think fundamentally, especially in 2021, in the 21st century, where so much of our communication is digital and the ability to broadcast has been democratized to the point that it is, I don't think that you can make the same moral case for the type of in-person, on-premises, disruptive, ruckus protest that dominated much of American history to this point. It's simply not necessary in order to petition your government for a redress of grievances. There are other ways to make your point and to engage in communication and to get your point across and to be heard. Now, to your point regarding people being locked away from the Capitol, yes, I agree that's absolutely a problem. But I wouldn't utilize that. I wouldn't point to that and say, therefore, we're now going to expand the capacity of people to enter residential areas and treat them as if they're the Capitol lawn, because they're not. As a city council member here in Albertville, I can tell you firsthand, we've got ordinances on the books that we deal with on a semi-regular basis that restrict the most petty and minute activities that you can engage in as a resident who lives here and pays taxes. And yet, I'm told often that under the auspices of the First Amendment, a total stranger can pull up a van and unload people outside my house or march them down Main Street or a county road or whatever they want to do, and engage in the same behavior that I would be fined or potentially hauled away for if I did it as a tax-paying resident. They could do whatever they want so long as they're protesting, so long as it's political speech. I just don't buy the concept. There is an inherent right. The rights of individuals are the same for every individual, and they do not conflict. There's this idea out there that we have to balance one person's rights against another person's rights. In truth, there is no balance because they don't conflict. I don't have a right to punch you in the face. I don't have a right to take your stuff. And so your desire to punch me in the face, your need for whatever it is you would steal from me is irrelevant. There's no conflict there. I have a right and you must respect it. Period. End of story.
Well, but let's just say there's no violence here. People aren't going to be punching each other or stealing stuff. They're going to be standing out in the street or on the sidewalk protesting outside of the chair of the Judiciary Committee's house. It's allowed today, but there are some cities that are thinking about shutting that down or preventing people from protesting. There's nuisance laws. They can't, probably without a permit, they can't be there past dark and keeping people awake and stuff. Lighting off fireworks, that's illegal already. So I think that there's something to be said when you're a legislator and you're walking through the Capitol. And by the way, last week was beautiful to have people back in the Capitol protesting, like whether they were for or against whatever I believed in. It was just nice to have people back. But there's something to be said about being a legislator maybe in a swing district, and you're worried about making sure that you're representing we all want to represent our districts, but I'm pretty firm in where I believe my district is. But you can walk through the Capitol and have people trying to sway your vote, and I think it's effective to have hundreds of people there, screaming, shouting, chanting for their issues, carrying signs. I think it's great. But if we're not there, or these legislators aren't listening, I kind of support protest in front of people's houses if they're respectful and stay within the other laws. And that's kind of where I'm at. I don't want to see anybody harmed, and I don't think that people should be shouting profanity and threatening kids, or if the lawmaker's not there, especially, that doesn't make sense at all. It should be, I don't know. I'm kind of conflicted on this one, man. Maybe I'm talking myself out of it too, but I'm so mad that the legislature wasn't in session. That's really the bottom line. I think it was terrible. It was an injustice that we just did this remote legislating, and I don't think that's going away.
Yeah, it's totally okay for once in a while for us to have a difference of opinion on the podcast. I don't think you should yield your point just because I'm expressing a contrarian view. I recognize that it's a contrarian view. I'm very well aware through the debates that I've had on this topic with people online and in person that I'm probably in the minority on this view. At least in public discourse. But when you have those people outside your house, you're going to come around to my position real quick, because the one right that we all have as property owners is a right to the peaceful enjoyment of that property. That is the basis upon which those nuisance laws that you referenced have been written. The reason why you can't light off fireworks, the reason why you can't have a loud party after 8 o'clock at night or whatever the ordinance is locally for you, is because your neighbors have the right to the peaceful enjoyment of their property. And they can't do that. They can't enjoy their property if you're encroaching upon them with noise, with fireworks, with blocking the street without a permit, whatever it is. And the circumstance that we're talking about here is one where, if I've got, let's say it's a relatively small group, 20 people outside my house protesting for whatever reason, because of something I tweeted or something I said on this podcast or whatever the case may be. Can my child freely enjoy the property on which he lives? Can he go outside and play? Can he get on his bike and ride down the street and go across the street and play with his friends like he typically does on any given day? Is that going to be prudent for me to allow that during that period of time that is designated by them? They get to decide arbitrarily the hours during which I get to enjoy my property that I pay for. And they're going to get protected by the law enforcement agents under the auspices of the First Amendment. They're going to get the protection from the law enforcement agents that I also pay for. So the whole thing is a violation of my rights. Them being here, they have no business here. They have no business in the street. This isn't their street. They're not using it for a lawful purpose. They're encroaching upon my ability to enjoy the use of my property. They're terrorizing to one degree or another my children who are innocent in whatever their grievance is. I just don't like the entire concept. But as far as the conflict you cite, the circumstance of the effect of barring people from being able to do this legitimately by coming down to the Capitol, it is definitely a scenario where government has created a situation where we have to be debating something like this when we never should have to have this kind of debate in the first place.
Yeah. Well, let's see if we can find something else to disagree with. I got on here. I did a post today on a bill that Bahr introduced 2 years ago. Well, 2 years ago, so it was last year too. It's House File 4530 of the last legislative session, and it's called the Defend the Guard Act. And what this bill does, basically, if you look back at the history of wars in America, we haven't actually declared a war since World War II, right? I mean, our Constitution says that Congress is the only one that can declare war. And then they've given the president some leeway to do some, police actions and some things temporarily. But the Vietnam War was a police action. It wasn't a war. And the longest war we've ever fought in Iraq, it was never declared war. It's amazing. But at some point, the president has continued to call up Minnesota's National Guard and send them overseas to fight our war. And the Defend the Guard Act basically says, now quote this, the governor must withhold or withdraw approval of the transfer of the National Guard to federal control in the absence of a military invasion of the United States, an insurrection, or a declaration of war by the United States Congress. So those would be the only three reasons why the president could call up our troops. Other than that, the governor must hold them in Minnesota. And I believe back in the 1980s, the Minnesota governor prevented the National Guard from being sent to Panama or something. But it's rarely been challenged. And more legislators across the country are introducing this Defend the Guard Act in the state legislatures. And I did not serve in the military, so I have, I'm really looking for a lot of opinions from people. But what do you think, Walter, on the premise of this bill?
Well, you were, at least on my end, during our production here, you were breaking up a little bit as you were describing the details of what qualified. But what I gathered was that unless this is an invasion of the United States or a congressionally declared war, were saying that the National Guard cannot or should not be controlled by the president of the United States. And if that's the gist of it, I on its face, I would say that's a good law. That's a good restriction. The National Guard exists primarily for the purpose of serving the states under the leadership of the governor, to at the pleasure of the people of the several states, and that's not how it has been um, practiced in recent decades, as you note. And this is definitely worth deliberating at the very least.
Yeah, and I think it also has a long-term impact on whether or not this passes. It has a long-term impact on the National Guard and what it means in the minds of Minnesotans. You know, there are, we found out during the Iraq War when the National Guard was being called up and sent over to Afghanistan or Iraq that there were husbands and wives with young children who were both in the National Guard, and they would serve a weekend a month and 2 weeks a year, training for, emergency medical response or sandbagging, or, doing things in support of the community. Because that's really what the National Guard has historically meant. And of course, if a foreign army invades our country, they're
Right.
kind of the militia that gets called up to defend. But rarely were they sent overseas to do anything, and certainly not for years to fight a war for, you know, on behalf of another country. So I think it would maybe make people question whether or not they would volunteer for the National Guard. If you're interested in going to serve in Iraq, maybe you would join one of the other armed forces instead. And so I think maybe it would hurt the National Guard's recruitment long term if we don't go back and redefine what the purpose of the National Guard is, or put some restrictions on the president abusing his powers. And I see this as really a reaffirming states' rights and choosing which conflict we get involved with, um, and really just kind of reining things, making it back, about protecting our border and protecting our state.
Yeah, no, I agree conceptually with all of that. It'll be interesting to consider any honest deliberation that follows, because I'm sure there's counterpoints that people could throw out that may have some legitimacy. But the spirit of what it is that you're getting after, I think, is right on. The overall, a there's been a centralization of power across the board, but when it comes to the military and the National Guard and the way in which these different uh, units interact and are commanded, the centralization of authority is pretty remarkable, certainly as a deviation from the original constitutional intent from our founding fathers.
Yeah. Well, I saw in the news too that New York Governor Andrew Cuomo declared gun violence a public health emergency in his state.
Right.
And so I don't know if that declaration gives him new powers to do things unilaterally. In most states, it does. Minnesota has tried to declare racism a public health
Yep.
crisis, and that's been a movement in the legislature that also brings some additional power, some different funding mechanisms. And we also, I believe, the Democrats are trying to make gun violence a public health crisis as well, so that it could be covered. We could be using money from the Department of Health, to basically do studies and fund education on gun awareness or something. And I hate the word gun violence because I don't like that term at all. I mean, it's really human violence. It's the humans that are being violent, not the gun. But
Right.
but then when they keep talking about gun violence, just I think it's misinforming people. But I use this opportunity to remind people that the Democrats are running things in DC, and we need to be prepared. And so we should be reaching out to our county commissioners and pushing sanctuary counties. So, Second Amendment sanctuary counties. I have a petition and uh, a, a form that you can download at jeremymunson.com/2A county, as in Second Amendment County. That it's a template that you can print out, put your county information in, and then bring it to your county commissioners at the next meeting and ask it to be on the agenda. and get a vote, get a roll call vote on your county commissioners and where they stand. And it basically would prohibit the county from spending any resources enforcing red flag laws or other unconstitutional laws that the legislature passes.
Yeah, I mean, sorry there, I got interrupted with some family stuff, so I didn't catch
Yeah.
the end of
Well,
that.
there's 15 counties in Minnesota that now have passed Second Amendment county resolutions,
Right.
and we've got 76 counties. So as more and more counties pass this, Democrats have to look at this and say, well, gosh, why pass red flag laws when they won't apply to X number of counties in the state, right? So if we keep on pushing these and getting more and more counties to get on board, we're going to basically prevent the Democrats from having an effect with gun. Now we're not going to give up the fight, but it's something that we can take locally, and it's something that if you're an activist for Second Amendment issues, grab a hold of this and organize. There are, I think, 30 Facebook groups in Minnesota, county specific. Sherburne County Second Amendment
Right.
defenders or whatever. You just kind of Google, or if you go on Facebook, just search for your county in Second Amendment sanctuary county, and you'll probably find a Facebook group you can join, get involved with people in your county, and push for this legislation.
Yeah, I going back to you talking about the abuse of the term public health emergency or public health crisis. This is something that we're going to see more and more of because and COVID paved the way because they saw what they were able to accomplish under the auspices of public health. And so now, if they can define basically their entire political agenda as a public health crisis, then it enables them to move forward and bowl over checks and balances and bowl over your rights in any way that they say fit. And tying that back into the story I was telling earlier about my kid getting text messages from the Michigan Department of Health uh, under the rationale that he needs to be vaccinated for COVID-19. If we live in New York, or apparently no matter where you live, because this is an interstate thing, what if the New York Department of Health were to start contacting my kid asking him about the guns in his house? Do your parents own guns? Text yes or no, Y or N to blah 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 blah. That's the type of thing. If you don't push back against the COVID stuff, then you're gonna get the anti-gun stuff. You're gonna get the CRT critical race theory stuff under the same premise of there being this public health emergency that needs to be dealt with. Your rights be damned. Your rights as a parent, your rights as a citizen. And so, indeed, activism at the local level is certainly called for and appropriate, but we also need to be pushing back at the state level against the perversion of public health, and perhaps even the entire concept of public health. Because I don't know what public health is. I know what my health is. I know what my family's health is. And there are decisions that may need to be made on a corporate level, a local level, but the idea that some guy in Duluth has a health concern that ought to be my business or that mine ought to be his, I think is a pretty dubious notion on its face.
Well, you brought up a really good a really good idea for a bill that I think I'm going to research and possibly write, that would limit the government's ability to contact minors over social media and by text message or phone. Um, because I think you're right. There should be some more involvement, especially in health decisions. I see that I made a post today about how we know that COVID's really over. It's because the CDC started making GIFs about diarrhea, because there's this like GIF of this little girl going down the water slide, and there's this big brown streak behind her, and it's talking about don't leave your mark at the pool this summer. It takes only one person with diarrhea to contaminate an entire pool. Um, I mean,
Right.
this is the CDC doing this work, but
Right.
these graphics are really also targeting children, and
Yep.
so is there a role for them to educate kids on STDs and stuff? This is something we need to
Right.
discuss But I think that the state legislature should have a thorough debate, discussion, and allow public input on whether or not you want the state educating or really marketing stuff to your kids, contacting them on their cell phone with little links to go register to get vaccinated, whether we want the state reaching out and automatically registering 15-year-olds for, to vote, all these types of things. And so I think it should be a good debate, and I'll craft a bill and get some public input on what we think the role is in contacting minors.
Yeah, I think it's good to make it that specific just because it really hammers it raises good questions about what the overall role of government is. Um, if I'm crafting my dream bill, I would make it broader. I mean, I like the fact that it's specific for these purposes that you're talking about, but it, the government contacting me at all should be an opt-in. Unless we're talking about my house is on fire, or they've got a warrant or something. Because what is the purpose of the Fourth Amendment, right? That you are having an interactive two-way conversation with a member of my household, asking them questions about what's going on in this household. That's a search. That's an interview. It's the same as a cop just stopping by and starting to have a conversation with no cause. That's an intrusion. There is no reason for the state to be doing that. Set aside reasons. They have no right to do that. And so, I shouldn't be getting texts as a 42, 43-year-old man. I shouldn't be getting random texts from departments of health across the nation asking me about my vaccination status. I never asked for them to contact me. If I need the Department of Health in this state or any other, I will let you know, Department of Health. Like, I don't need you to be the one who reaches out to me and asks me whether or not I need you. The answer is, have you heard from me yet? If no, then I don't need you. Leave me alone.
Well, I mean, Joe Biden announced this week that his administration will be going door to door if they have to vaccinate people. They're really trying to push vaccinations, and they're going to start a door to door campaign. Like, really?
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to work in my neighborhood, but coming to the door where, I mean, I've door knocked a lot, thousands of hours, and frequently the parents aren't home, and you end up talking to, a 12-year-old. Of course, the first thing you ask is, "Hey, are your parents home?" And then when I do find kids that go, "No, my parents are not home," I'm like, "You're not supposed to say that. You're
Right.
supposed to say they're out back or something." But
Right.
then the CDC people are going to be like, "Well, your parents vaccinated?" No, they're not. I mean, it's none of their business. And I think, do you have a warrant should be, taped to the front of your door.
Right. Or how about this? How about, you express no interest in vaccination, and while they're sitting there, they start to bring up, well, it looks like your outbuilding out there might not be in compliance with this, that, or the other thing. Or we stopped by earlier this morning and your 12-year-old was by himself. Should CPC or Child Protective Services be involved in this?
Yeah.
So like I say, any excuse or rationale that you come up with for the initiation of contact between the government and the citizen potentially opens the door to Fourth Amendment violations. And so it just shouldn't happen. If there isn't a warranted reason, and I mean specifically warranted, not generally warranted, a specific reason that I should be going to this house to talk to this guy about this thing that I've taken to a court and the court has said, yes, you may. In the absence of that, then there shouldn't be any of this going on. Door to door, government agents just checking up on you. Talk about dystopian horror. I mean, it really is coming to life.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll reach out to you, Walter, on trying to draft that legislation. One of the things that's great about working through the research department to draft a bill like this is I can also ask them, please list all of the reasons why, or all of the state agencies that have a marketing department that solicit feedback from people, right? I mean, there's one way direction stuff like information they send out, but there's also they send out information expecting a response. And then we could also ask, tell me all the departments and the reasons why they would market to children.
Right.
And, they have to come up with, they send out information. The research department goes out to all state agencies. We need information from you on, how, how you or why you contact children. And it'd be interesting to see this response. And I think now, in the interim between legislative sessions, is a great time to work on a bill like this, because it takes time to get feedback from all the agencies. And I think it would be pretty telling.
Well, and I think again, the reason why I like the specificity of your idea for a bill, of talking about children, is because I guarantee you one of the things you're gonna get come back, from the administrators and bureaucrats who are doing it, is they're going to be like, well, how are we supposed to know whether or not any given, we're getting this list of phone numbers from whoever's selling it or whatever public list is available, and we're just texting all the numbers. We don't know whether or not it's a 12-year-old. I guarantee that would be a response that you would get, to which the appropriate answer is exactly. Exactly. That's why it needs to be an opt-in. You don't even know who you're talking to. And so how do you're telling me that you're willing to initiate a communication that may be inappropriate for the person who receives it, just to make sure that you throw a giant dragnet across the populace? That's unacceptable. This is why government, historically and properly, needs to get specific warrants to take specific action when they're engaging with citizens. You don't just randomly show up to people and start asking them questions about their lives and applying pressure for them to act in certain ways that they didn't choose and have no interest in.
I'll have to follow up with you on what I hear back, or maybe we figure out how to phrase it. But I like the idea of this bill. It would be a good one to work on. Um, for the next legislative session. One last thing I wanted to give an update on, from the legislature, is although we have ended, there is one committee that is continuing its work, and that is the redistricting committee. And I'm on that committee, and I plan on being a pretty vocal member. But I know that ultimately the courts will likely decide the redistricting, but it is important that we come up with a kind of a state of principles, a list of principles that we want the courts to take into consideration as they help redraw the lines, which will ultimately happen. And so we're going to be meeting several times this month, in the month of July, to come up with that list of principles in both the House and the Senate. In that legislation will likely come to the floor for a vote in the special session in September. So kind of more to come on that one. But if you have ideas on how we should be drawing lines or what principles should come into play, reach out to me. One of the things that just disgusts me is that one of the principles that usually gets taken into consideration is consideration of where an incumbent legislator lives. So they don't want to redraw lines and put, Munson and Torkelson in the same district, because, that would cause a conflict. Well, it shouldn't matter where people live.
Right.
We redraw the lines where it makes sense. In fact, I think I would like to see a principle that legislative districts be square. Like that should be a principle. We want to make it just doesn't matter. And, one of the things that people don't like it going through the middle of town. They don't want to draw a legislative district through a town. Well, first of all, 90% of the people don't even know who their legislator is. So I don't even think it matters. But what's the downside of having two legislators representing parts of a town and having two people advocating for you in St. Paul? That's actually should be a benefit, not a hindrance. Two people at the town halls, who cares? You get two different opinions. I think that I don't think it hurts to redraw lines as square as possible, and it goes across a lake and through a town. The people that it impacts, the legislators, so it makes it harder for them to door knock if they have to go around the other side of the lake to catch this little corner. Who cares? It's the people that we're trying to be most fair to in how we draw the line. So I don't know. I'm already getting opinionated on it, and I haven't really dug in that deep to what the principle should be. But what are your thoughts on how we should be drawing our lines, Walter?
Well, I've long thought that it needs to move away from the way it's historically been done, which is, legislators who have an obvious conflict of interest in determining the shape of districts, getting together and deciding what the shape of those districts are going to be. It ought to be whatever the process is, and it's a difficult problem to solve, and I don't claim to have the specific solution, but I can tell you principally what it ought to be informed by and what it ought to look like. It should be objective. It should be based upon readily available and uncompromisable or incorruptible, let's use that word, incorruptible metrics that anybody can just see with their own eyes and easily understand. So, however many miles, however many people, however, whatever a square, like you said, whatever metrics you come up with should be very easy to see for the average person as to whether or not they're being followed. And then beyond that, it ought to be determined in such a way that it's equally applied to where people are represented equally and getting in without any consideration of political impact. Because that's the problem right now. You talk about drawing two legislators, two sitting incumbents into the same district. Not wanting to do that is a political consideration. Wanting to have a red district or a blue district, that's a political consideration. Looking at what the legislative majorities may or may not be over the course of the next 10 years, that's a political consideration. None of that should have anything to do with it whatsoever. It should be whether or not how the populace that lives in a particular area is going to get a representative. That's it. And then whatever the politics is, that's what it is organically. God forbid that the process actually end up representing people where they live based upon what they actually think, as opposed to the political priorities and legislative parliamentary concerns of incumbents and majority leaders and governors and state party leaders.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be an interesting discussion, and I hope to bring up the fact that both parties have such a strong interest in winning the majority. It's obvious, but there should be principles that we can put ahead of that to redraw lines in the most fair way possible. And stop this crazy gerrymandering. And one of the principles that's being pushed by the Democrats is not to divide an ethnic community. So in other words, to basically separate people and,
it's
have
called segregation, Jeremy. That's what they're advocating for.
That's right. There we go. So they want segregation. And I understand the principle. If you have a pocket of Democrats, the obvious conservative thing is to say, well, let's just slice it in half and take those two pockets of Democrats and push it into a larger group of Republicans. And that's what both sides want to do. But we should be able to draw lines in a mathematically sound way, and without regards to anything, and then work from there. If there's specific towns that are messed up because of it, maybe you can go around a town. But I don't know. I just assume go right through whatever town it is, and it shouldn't make that big of a difference. Nobody cares who their rep is. We want fair representation, and that's probably the largest principle. So. More to come on that. I'll keep you posted on what we learn and some of the principles as I write the bill for what our principles should be in redistricting. So great. Walter, thanks for joining me for another episode. We've got some good material here for the listeners, and hopefully our audio works better this time. And I forgot to, at the onset of the show, hope everybody had a great 4th of July, or Independence Day, as I like to call it. I hate it when people say Happy 4th of July. It's our Independence Day, man. Let's just say what it is. So hope everybody had a great Independence Day, and we will cut another show for you next week on the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane.